All right, please be joined this time by Coach Timmerman at North Forsyth, one of the best to do it. Listen to Coach. He's talking about the off-season development. He's going to do a great job. Coach, let me get out of the way. Take it away.
Yes, sir. Thanks for having me. Like I said, at North Forsyth High School, my name is Jake Timmerman, offensive line coach there. Um, just kind of a little bit about me. This was I think I'm losing track now. This is my 12th year coaching. Um, I was at North High School before that. That's where I got my start in coaching. I was there for 5 years. Was fortunate enough to win a state championship there. I went on from there to coach offensive line at Grayson High School for 4 years. Had a lot of success there. Was able to win a state championship there, and now I'm here at North Forsyth. I've been here for 3 years. So just a little bit. We're talking specifically just like off-season development. Today's not, this is not going to be like a huge scheme heavy talk or anything. I know we're all about to probably get that later and stuff, but some of the guys that really influenced me in kind of the philosophy and the approach I take for like off-season development is guys like Charles Bentley at his company Offensive Line Performance. Josh Richardson over here, Velocity Football here in Georgia was a big influence in me and putting some of this stuff together. And then just other like-minded OL coaches that I've gotten to know through social media and Twitter stuff, like Tom Blazer and Kyle Murphy, Robert Ortiz, a lot of guys like that have had a lot of influence on how I approach kind of building this offensive line, training regimen that we do in the off season. So just kind of the general philosophy and the principles that we go by is just having a process, right? Even if you don't necessarily follow this process that I'm going to outline to you, step by step, right? Because everybody's schedule is a little bit different. Everybody's needs are a little bit different. But just having a process and having a plan, I think is important. And that starts with building from the ground up, right? Having a big focus on building from the ground up, right? We're going to put a big emphasis on, kind of like it says down there with mobility and flexibility, in our ankles, our knees, and our hips. That's a big part of it too. We got to have offensive linemen that can move. And then your core is going to link everything together. We spend a lot of time on like isometric work, rotational and anti-rotational emphasis. So not just sitting down doing a bunch of crunches, but like specific core exercises that are going to apply to how offensive linemen play and use their core during football. And then an emphasis on unilateral or like single leg exercises. There's not really going to be times, many times where you're pushing, with both legs like a squat, right? That obviously that stuff's good for building strength and mass. But we put an emphasis on unilateral exercises of being able to move our body off of one leg. And then we try to teach movement from a biomechanics standpoint before moving on to football specific movements, right? Just being able to just move your body in general before we get on to the football stuff. So again, kind of following along with, talking about a lot of stuff that I've learned from guys like Charles Bentley and OLP. We talk about 8 angles all the time, whether that's in our off-season approach or whether that's in season when we're, going through drills and individual or whatever it is. But the general idea is, you're going to move on 8 angles, like you can kind of see on the graphic there, forwards, backwards, side to side, or kind of some sort of 45-degree angle in between, right? And that could vary with the play. But that's what we're trying to do with our training is how can we best move on all of those different angles, whether it's run, pass, whatever. We talk about having, being able to bend, and that means being able to get in our stance with 3, 4, 5-degree angles, right? In our hips, our knees, and our ankles. We talk about force through the ground, right? Being able to apply force and move in a direction, right, in an attempt to try and move another human being or to stop the movement of another human being. And so with that, we talk about drive catch all the time in our pass pro and pressure to pressure, right? And that's kind of the end part of this training is the pressure to pressure part, right? Of actually, getting another human body involved, right, as you start to ramp up for like your spring football. So just kind of a basic schedule, right? And again, you don't have to follow this specific schedule, but this is just right. If you were going to sit down and build a training, regimen for your offensive line group starting in February, and then going all the way through basically to get ready for spring football, which most of us start basically that last week of April or the first week of May. Spending the month of February building a foundation, right? We're not doing any football stuff for the month of February. And I know that may sound counterproductive, but the focus of February is building that foundation. All right. You see the question down there. Can I move my own? Right. To me, there's no point in working double teams or, pulling or whatever it is in February when you're still working on guys not really being able to move their own body efficiently. So we spend the month of February, and I'll go through and talk about some of these things more specifically, working on things like ankle stiffness, okay, having strong ankles. And a big part of that is helping the stability within the knee, because we're talking about like force through the ground, right, and driving force through the ground. You're putting a lot of force and pressure on your joints in your leg, right? Whether that's your ankle, and if it's not your ankle, right, your ankle is not strong enough to handle that force, then what you're going to have is instability go up through the ankle to the knee, and then from the knee to the hip. And that's where you start to see knee injuries, hip injuries, really rooting from the fact that the stiffness and the strength of the ankle is not where it needs to be to handle the forces that are being put through your lower half when you are playing offensive line. Hip mobility and adductor strength, right? Again, a lot of this stuff that we're going to talk about is maybe stuff that your general weight training class is probably not going to hit or focus on very much, at least. But for offensive line play, we always talk about playing with our knees inside our ankles, and that comes from having strong adductors, right? Again, we talk about unilateral movements, being able to move my body off of one leg, right? Being able to push off of one leg and create force by pushing off of one leg. Core strength, and again, right, just focusing on, can I move my own body? And then we talk about kind of anti-rotational, can I prevent someone from moving my body? March is when we'll get into stance and posture maintenance, right? And yes, I'm going to spend a month on just getting in a stance and holding that stance. Your stance is just as much a skill as anything else, right? As much as your pass protection, as much as your down blocks or whatever it is. And that's, you're not going to pass protect every play. You're not going to run block every play, but you are going to get in a stance every play. And that's going to be where you start every play from. And so if that's the case, we want to take time to make sure that our starting position, our stance, is as good as it can possibly be. Because it's very hard to finish in a winning position if you're not starting in a winning position. So we spend a lot of time just going through stance, and I have a sort of set of parameters that I give my guys on how to get in a stance. It's one of those things where there are some non-negotiables, but you also have to be flexible with your guys on what works for them, whether that's 2-point stance, 3-point stance, kind of exactly how wide or deep their feet are. And that's something I can talk about another time, but having parameters to allow your guys to be flexible, right? Because you know how it is in high school football, your left tackle might be 6'5" and your right guard maybe 5'11". So those guys aren't going to have exactly the same stance. And then April is when we'll finally start to get into some football specific training, right? With dummies and things of that sort, right? Talking about, this is the footwork we want to use on a double team. This is the footwork we want to use on a short pass set, and going from there. So again, you don't have to follow it, just like this. You can use a condensed version. I've used a condensed version of it as well, where you kind of just maybe mainly work through March and April. But just talking, if you were to start, in a couple of weeks with the start of February, this is how I've structured it in the past. All right. So other questions that I've gotten and that I kind of work through myself is, how do I marry this with weight training, right? Because the last thing you want to do is, your kids go in and they spend 45 minutes to an hour, whatever it is, lifting that day. And then they come to you, and let's say you're doing your offensive line training in the afternoon or whatever it is, right? Um, you don't want to do the same things they just did in weight training earlier in the day, right? Or maybe you're doing your stuff in the morning before weight training, right? You don't want to do the same stuff with them that they're going to do, later in weight training period. And so this is just an example, right? So like, when I put this together originally, I got with our strength and conditioning coach when I was at Grayson, and we basically sat down and I was like, all right, how can I structure my offensive line training to marry up with what you're doing in the weight room? And so that's another thing I would encourage, offensive line coaches to do, or any position coaches, as you are, planning some type of off-season training, is to get with your weight room guy, get with your strength coach, so that the things that you're focusing on can complement what goes on in the weight room each day. So, like, for example, Monday, this is like, say you're doing 4 days a week, right? Monday was going to be a big power day, right? High intensity, low volume, going to focus on linear speed. And so for us, offensive line wise, that may be a day where we focus on things like hip mobility, more unilateral plyometrics, and then some light Olympic work. And then, Tuesday, it's going to be an upper and a lower, which is medium intensity but high volume, some change of direction, conditioning. And so that day we may focus on like hip hinge and ankle work, right? To kind of complement some of the stuff we're doing. But I think a lot of it just comes down to whatever, and everybody's weight room schedule or training schedule, is a little bit different. So I would just say, get with your strength coach, your weight room guy, and figure out, okay, what can you do to complement what they're doing in weight training, and put your kind of plan together from there, right? So one of the things we talked about, right, was ankle stiffness, and there's going to be, kind of some core things that we go through with this training. And so one of the things that I started using was what's called a spring ankle progression, right, from Cal Dietz, and kind of what that looks like. And I've got a couple of videos here, and these are just some examples. There's more to it, but basically it's kind of an elevated position, and training the stiffness or the strength of your ankles. Right, and you can kind of see what's happening in the video there. Typically, I'll start out with doing this for like 30 seconds with my guys, and then we want to build up as quick as we can, being able to hold that position for 60 seconds. This is another example. This is position 2 of working on ankle stiffness, where instead of your bottom of your foot being more parallel, now you can see, right, you're really raising up and working on ankle stiffness at a different angle. So those are some things like we'll do towards like of our training sessions. Again, working on ankle stiffness, having strong ankles to be able to handle the amount of force that we're putting through as we're driving force through the ground. Resistance band ankle work is always good, and there's a bunch of different exercises that you can do with resistance bands to help your ankles. Catchers is another one we do, and basically it's you get down in like a catcher stance, like for baseball, but instead of being like flat-footed, your heels are elevated, right? And again, you're holding that stiffness in the ankles in that position. And then we'll do like a basic walking circuit, where we just walk, sort of from one end of the weight room to the other. Focusing on, we'll walk like on the outside part of our foot, we'll walk on the inside part of our foot, we'll walk on our toes with our heels elevated as high as we can, and then we'll walk on our heels with the balls of our feet and our toes elevated as high as we can. Again, the focus being on holding the stiffness of the ankles, right? You're not looking for like your foot to be bobbing up and down, right? If you were, let's say you're walking on your toes, you don't want to see the heels like bobbing up and down, right? You want to see stiff ankles, working on focusing on keeping that position all the way through. So that's a big focus. We typically do that stuff at the beginning of our training sessions. And again, this is kind of the stuff we'll focus on in February. We're also put a big emphasis on hip mobility. Again, there's tons of different exercises you can use, right? I'm not saying these are the only ones you have to do. I try to vary it up as much as I can. So whether it's knee flops or 90-90s or rock and rollers or whatever you call them, right, where you're just you're on your butt, your knees are at about 90 degrees, right, heels on the ground, you're just rotating from side to side. Fire hydrants, deep squat holds, butt walks, overhead duck walks are a big one we do a lot, right? So just like a PVC pipe, for example, over the head, right? You get them to sink down into that deep duck walk position, and you just go, for a few yards back and forth, and we'll do that like where they're going forwards, where they're going backwards, and then where they're also like walking, sideways, like side to side, right and left. Goblet and overhead squats are great, and then your traditional over unders, right, that everybody does. Whether you're taking like your safety racks in your weight room and going over and under those, or maybe you have some spare hurdles from your track program, right, where you're basically just going over and under. Again, working on the hip mobility. It's a big part of it. And then with that, right, staying kind of in that same room with your hips is hip hinge. This is a critical part of offensive line play. To me, the days of the old school, sit back in your chair, right, while you're pass protecting like that, that's not how it's played. That's not how the game's played anymore. You've got to play with good hip hinge, both in your pass pro and your run game blocking. We don't want to play straight up. We want to be able to keep our head and neck and spine in a neutral position, again, hoping to avoid and prevent injuries from a neck spinal side of things. Really with that hip hinge, right, you want to see them push their butt back. It's when you're teaching this, a lot of times guys will just want to kind of squat a little bit, but it's not a squat, right? It's a hinge. And so you want to push your butt back. You should feel it in your glutes and your upper hamstrings, not so much your quads. You don't ever want to let your knees come too far forward over your toes. And then, obviously you don't want to like lock your knees out either. So like a good thing for that is, if you notice guys are kind of, going one way too far the other, is take like a bench, like you use for bench press or whatever, and put it like an inch in front of their shins while they're just standing normally, and then have them hinge. All right. And that way, if you've got a guy that when he hinges, his knees go way too far forward, right? That'll kind of give him a visual and sort of a tangible, cue that, my shins are going too far forward, my knees are going too far forward, right? I need to keep them back. And then same thing, you can take the bench and put him around behind him, right, sort of an inch away from the back of his calves. If they're, locking their legs out, or if they're pushing their legs back too far. So again, just having sort of those tangible physical cues that they can use while they're in their hinge. Great exercises for working hip hinge, barbell hip thrusters, right? Kettlebell swings are great. I love kettlebell swings. They're great exercise. Barbell good mornings. Nordic hip hinge. If you don't know what a Nordic hip hinge is, that's basically you're in that position, right, where the guys are doing like the hamstring, where they're somebody's holding their legs, or they got their legs hooked or something like that on the ground, and they're falling forward, right? So a Nordic hip hinge is that same position, but instead of falling forward basically on your chest, you're doing a hip hinge from that position, and that's a really good one. That's a really good one that I get a lot of mileage out of. RDLs, either with a barbell or a dumbbell, are great. It's so funny. You can always see, who really has good stability and strength in their core and stuff like that, just doing a simple dumbbell RDL, right? I've seen some of the best, athletes, or some of the strongest guys on the team struggle to do a dumbbell RDL, like a single leg dumbbell RDL. So those are great. I'm big on single leg dumbbell RDLs for offensive linemen. And then resistance band hip extensions are always good, right? Where you're on your knees, basically, kind of sitting back, your butt's sitting on your heels. You've got the resistance band wrapped around your waist, and the other side is tied to like the bottom of your weight rack or something like that. And there's tension in the band. And then, basically you're pressing your hips forward, right? You're kind of coming up and pressing your hips forward. Is a great exercise as well. Get a lot of mileage out of those. Adductors are a big part of it. Different things you can do for your adductors: prone isometric squeezes, meaning basically the athlete's laying on their back, and you take something light, like a soccer ball, or a volleyball or something like that, and you place it between their ankles, and they have to squeeze, right? They have to engage their adductors and squeeze their legs together to hold the volleyball, right? And they're holding it off the ground, probably about like 4 inches off the ground, and they're engaging their adductors. You can do it like between their ankles or between their knees. If you're going between your knees, you can kind of increase the weight a little bit. I use like 6-pound medicine balls, and those are great. But down towards the ankles, especially like if this is their first time doing it, I would go with something lighter, like a volleyball or soccer ball. Swingy leg with tension bands. It's like everybody does, like with track or kind of your sprint mechanics or whatever, where your legs just kind of going across your body. The band's wrapped around your ankle, and the other end's wrapped around like the bottom of the weight rack or something, and you're basically just bringing your leg in towards your body, right? Working your adductors. Medicine ball hold walks are huge. We do those almost every day. Basically, that 6-pound medicine ball, like I mentioned a second ago, you're basically going to have the athletes take that, put it between their legs, and engage their adductors, right? Squeezing the ball with their knees, and they're walking while they're doing this. They're very short steps. You're not like pounding the ground or anything. They're very short, controlled steps, and you'll go for 5 to 10 yards, kind of depending on the level of athlete that you're working with. And again, kind of like we talked about with the overhead duck walks, we'll go forward, we'll go backward, and we'll go side to side with it. Do those all the time. Posture maintenance with the tension bands, resistance bands, whatever you want to call them, basically meaning like you've got your athlete in a 2-point stance or even a 3-point stance, whatever it is, and you're using resistance bands on the ends. The bands are wrapped around right above their knee. And then either you or another athlete or whatever is basically, directly to their side, and you're pulling those resistance bands, again, forcing them to engage their adductors and not allowing their knees basically to flare out, is what we're looking for there. And then lateral lunge slides are always really good. You can do those, like doing those on a gym floor or something like that, but like a towel or something like that under your foot, just so you've got that kind of smooth slide action you can go for there. Core training is big for us. Again, a lot of it's isometric and then like rotational and anti-rotational. So any and every kind of plank variation you can think of, right? Really focusing on having good technique, not letting the butt go too high or too low. Dead bugs are great. Dead bugs are one that they're going to look at and be like, that doesn't look that hard. And then once you start to really emphasize like the technique part of it, it'll wear them out. Bird dogs are really good. Again, right, we're focusing on having good technique of really keeping our core tight while we're doing those. Palloff press variations, that's more kind of the anti-rotational, because as much as we want to be able to generate force by rotating our core, we also want to not rotate if we don't want to. So we do different variations of Palloff press. We'll do a standing position, both static and dynamic, meaning whether you're just holding the resistance band kind of in front of you, or where you're pushing it away from your body, going up and down. Or we'll also do like a lunge iso position as well, where you're just kind of in a lunge position and you're doing the Palloff press from that position. Suitcase holds are great for working the obliques. Basically meaning like you're going to take like a 45-pound dumbbell or whatever it is and just hold it in one hand. You got nothing in the other hand. And the objective, right, is to keep the shoulders level, right, to engage the core, to basically not let the body tilt one way or the other. Because what a lot of kids will do is they'll want to like overcompensate, and so they'll end up like leaning away from the side they have the weight on. So you want to make sure that they're nice and straight, that the shoulders are level, and you can do those static where they're literally just standing there holding the weight. You can do it walking like a carry, or you can combine it with step ups as well, right? And then rotational med ball throws. There's a few different variations that you can do with those, right? But those are always really good. Unilateral training, again, there's a million different exercises you can use, but I think variation is good, just so your kids don't get bored, honestly. But also like whatever works for you, like what equipment you may have, or something you want to put extra emphasis on. So there's a million different exercises you can do. These are just some examples of stuff that I've done before. Lunge iso holds and lunge iso pumps. I will talk about those for a second. Lunge iso holds, basically meaning you get in a lunge position with your that sort of down knee like 4 or 5 inches off the ground, and you just hold that position. You can do that just with body weight as beginners. As they start to get better and stronger, you can add like 20-pound dumbbells in each hand, or whatever. You can even like have basically like the bar, like a barbell, going sort of between their legs, and you can add weight there, and they hold with both hands. And then a lunge iso pump is basically you get in a lunge position, your knees on the ground, and then you basically just lift yourself off the ground with the knee coming about 6 inches off the ground. And you do, those are great to do at the beginning of a training session, because they really, really get the body going and really get those legs activated. Just regular lunges forward and back are great. Single leg bounds, both just lateral and also at an angle, are excellent. That's doing forward and backwards on an angle is really good. Single leg step ups, and again, there's variations of those where you can have weight overhead. You can do the suitcase hold. You can have them hold a medicine ball. There's lateral crossover variations, right? Again, we talked about single leg RDLs with the dumbbells. Single leg stand ups, meaning like you're just like sitting on a box that's probably a little lower than like hip level. And basically the objective is, without like, sort of popping yourself up with your upper body, is basically just to be able to stand up on one leg. It's, it sounds easy, but it's not as easy as you may think. Single leg box jumps, single leg step offs, pistol squats, all those are great. And you kind of have to, with the single leg stuff, especially with the young guys, you really have to sort of moderate, all right, what can they handle? You probably have to keep it simple. And just body weight stuff for your young guys. And then as you progress, right, as they get stronger, then you can get into some of the more advanced stuff. We'll do a little bit of like Olympic lifts and upper body, not a ton, right? They're going to get most of their Olympic lifts and upper body, hopefully, in their weight training class, but we will implement it mainly to teach athletes how to create force, but also how to absorb or catch the force, right? Like when you're catching a power clean, right? That's you absorbing or catching force. So, whether it's single arm dumbbell or a barbell snatch, same thing, push press, split jerk. We'll do some bench, not much. Landmine, single arm floor presses are good for building some shoulder stability and strength. So we will incorporate this in there, but again, they are probably going to get most of this type of stuff in their weight training class. So I don't put a ton of emphasis on it, but we will incorporate it. And then we get into our stance. From there, right, we want to find stability in our width, then strength in our stagger. Everybody's going to be different, right? Not everybody's going to be shoulder width, toe to heel. That may work for somebody, but it's not going to work for everybody, because everybody's going to have different femur lengths and heights and flexibility and stuff like that. So having, again, a set of parameters that your athletes work within. We talk about 50-50 weight distribution. All right. We don't want to be, leaning one side or the other. We're going to turn our outside toes slightly out. We need to be able to press through our midfoot. Then we close the door, right? Because naturally, if you turn your toe out, your hips are going to follow. So when we talk about closing the door, I mean getting the hips square to the line of scrimmage. We squeeze the adductors, so we play with our knees inside our ankles, right? We talk about that outside leg being your kickstand, right? Your kickstand like on a bike. We get into our hip hinge, we lock the elbows and slide the hands down to our wrist over kneecaps when we're in the teaching phase of this. And we talk about rolling our shoulders and squeezing our scaps, right? Of being in a good, strong foundation. And I can talk more about that later if people have questions. Then we start to get into the application of the force through the ground principles, right? Of the drive catch, pushing the ground away from you, down and away, pushing through your midfoot. The most common mistake you're going to see is guys pushing off their toes, right? We don't want to push off our toes, right? Nobody's going to go in the weight room tomorrow and go for a squat max and squat on their tippy toes. You're going to have your whole foot in the ground. And so the same principle applies here when we're trying to generate force on the football field. We want all our cleats in the ground. We want to apply force to the ground through our midfoot. Teaching the catch, a lot of people kind of skip over this or don't spend much time on it, but I would, at least spend, a couple days on this. It's like splashing a puddle of water, right? You want to splash the puddle away from you, not straight down. If you go and, splash a puddle of water with your foot straight down, the water's going to splash up and get on you. You want to, splash to the side. So you splash the water away from you, right? We want to be on the inside part of our foot. If you're landing on the outside part, that can lead to rolling over, rolling ankles, not a lot of stability. And then we'll start from a knee. We'll incorporate a med ball, and then we'll go up to like 3 sets, just kind of, again, working on the basic movements of it. And really from there, we'll go all 8 angles. We'll do run game, pass game, different angles of this drive catch principle, both from our knee on the ground and our knee on a med ball. And so again, just kind of what that looks like, right? It's just, whether you can just set up 3 cones on either side, for just working on those different angles and driving off a knee. Same thing in the pass game, right? Just giving them different landmarks as they work on applying that principle of force through the ground, right? Drive catch principle specifically in the pass game, like we talked about, of working those different angles, right? So that's kind of just a broad overview of this offensive line training regimen that I put together for the off season. Like I said, you don't have to follow it, day by day or exactly whatever works for you and your athletes and your schedule at your school. But just like I said at the beginning, be process oriented, focus on, working from the ground up, and being able to move your own body. That's the biggest thing before you start talking about double teams and pass pro and, all this other stuff, is just get your athletes comfortable with moving their own body. And I think you'll see a lot of great results.
Yeah, Coach. People don't have any idea the level of athleticism that goes into the offensive line. I know that's something that you've tried to fight the last few years, but the education of the athletes and the amount of movement and skill that it takes to do that. And this obviously, I mean, it makes a difference, and there's a science to it. And even the guys that back in the day acted like some meathead offensive line coaches were still teaching a science.
Yeah.
If you were close to them, you knew that. And no, that was really good, man. I appreciate you doing it.
Yes, sir. Absolutely. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, always good to talk to you. Take care, Coach.
Yes, sir. You too. Thank you.